My name is Valerie Ortiz. I'm the assistant planner here in Stowe. And I just want to let you know that tonight was really organized by the Gleasondale Neighborhood Area Subcommittee of the Planning Board. And this group was formed earlier this summer with the intention of coming up with strategies and researching what has been done in other towns in the area in terms of historic preservation. And so we're really excited tonight to be able to welcome Chris Skelly from the Mass Historic, just to give us kind of an introduction into historic preservation and to hopefully facilitate a discussion in terms of what we could see here in Gleasondale and in Stowe. So welcome.
Thank you, Valerie. It's good to be here. Very good to be here. I grew up about 8 miles from here, so right next to the Ossipet River. So it's good to be, wow, there it is again. Wow. Any Neshoba High School graduates here? Oh, yeah. 74. Wow. Did you have a teacher named Mr. Skelly? Was he the best teacher you've ever had? Choose your words carefully. Okay. All right. Diplomatic there. Yeah, my father taught at Neshoba here for 17 years. From right around the early 70s to into the 80s. So yeah, I'm very familiar with Central Mass. So I work at Mass Historical Commission now, and I work with all the local historical commissions around the state. So that's usually who I do the workshops for. I do a lot of training workshops for the local historical commissions from Provincetown out to the Berkshires and everybody else around the state. Today is a little different because mostly it's not local historical commissions here, right? So we have, who's a member of the Stowe Historical Commission? Okay, so we got good representation from Stowe Historical Commission. Are there any other historical, yep. Any other local historical commission members here from other towns? You're from Littleton Historical Commission? Okay, great. Hudson Historical Commission, okay. And where's everybody else from? Are you residents of Gleasondale? Who's a resident resident of Gleasondale? Okay. Okay, great. And who else hasn't raised their hand yet that I'm kind of wondering? Okay, we have Worcester here. And you're, okay, still live in Stowe. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm probably going to run my presentation differently so I can kind of get into more what your questions are. I was handed a list of questions earlier today, and I was like, oh, okay, that means I should probably run my presentation a little differently than I was planning, and that's fine. So I run all of my presentations as a discussion, so I don't do anything in terms of waiting for questions at the end. It's a discussion the whole time, so I like to hear from the audience as much as I'm doing for the talking, and that helps me to know, kind of getting what you want out of the presentation, and helps us sort of go along, sort of go side by side as we're going along. So I'll get started just to go over some basics, and then we'll see where we go from there in terms of covering the things that you'd like to cover. Okay, so I work at Mass Historical Commission. We were established back in 1963. That's who we have working at our office: architectural historians, preservation planners, a planner like myself, archaeologists. The state archaeologist is in our office. There's an architect there. So my role is really just to work with the local government programs. So I work with all of the local historical commissions around the state. So 351 cities and towns, and I get to work with all of them. That all sort of started back in the 1960s. The idea of local historical commissions came about because we had lots and lots of urban renewal and highway construction, and a real recognition that Massachusetts was changing very, very dramatically in the 60s. So that was the idea in the 1960s, 1963, to have the concept of local historical commissions to try to do some identification, get a better sense of what's in each of the towns. So when I've done some research through our archives and see the old letters that were written in the early 60s, and we're basically asking all of the towns, what kind of historic resources do you have in your town? Because it's trying to get a sense of what that was before highways and urban renewal and things like that started. All right, who wants to tell me what the difference between a historical society and a historical commission? What's the difference there? Yes. Okay. Which one's the social group? Society. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, they're social in terms of they often have speakers come in and they have a museum and functions and things like that. So it's educational, but they usually have a museum. They're more property oriented, specific property oriented. Yeah, and so a society is often a membership organization, could have 50 members, 100 members, something like that. So commission, on the other hand, part of municipal government. And has only 3 to 7 members. So how many members do you have in Stowe? 5 members, okay. So yeah, so historical commissions, part of municipal government, appointed by the Board of Selectmen, just like the Conservation Commission, Zoning Board of Appeals, and other boards and commissions. I like this sign right here because Historical Commission is nice and prominent right there on the sign. So they are an active part of municipal government right there. It's quite often that I deal with local historical commissions that aren't as active in their local government as they need to be. So it's important to recognize that you are a part of municipal government, and the idea here is that you're doing community-wide historic preservation planning. Okay, so why do we need local historical commissions? So I take a phone call about 24 hours before this right here, quite often. And I need local historical commissions to engage as a part of planning so that I don't have to take these calls at the last second, and with usually a phone call somewhere along the lines of Mass Historical Commission, you can stop this from happening, right? And my response is, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of a disappointment here. No, I can't stop that. Our office doesn't have that kind of authority. Okay, so historical commissions basically do community-wide historic preservation planning, and that has 3 steps here: identifying historic resources, evaluating historic resources, and that third one, protecting historic resources. So step 1, identifying historic resources. The idea is that you have to identify the kinds of things that you have in your community. That's the first step of planning in general, knowing the kinds of historic resources that you have in your town. So buildings, town commons, landscapes, bridges, burial grounds, knowing everything ahead of time, because you can't really think about how you're going to protect anything. You're not going to be able to think about what's important to your community unless you've done some identifying ahead of time. So that's true on the town-wide level. It's certainly true on the neighborhood or village level as well, in terms of Gleasondale. All right. How many people are familiar with something that looks like that? Historical Commission members all raising their hand. I like to see that. So these are called inventory forms or survey forms, and it's basically a means of identifying and documenting historic resources. So these are forms done by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, but they're filled out through all kinds of other means. So the first thing to find out in terms of doing a historic preservation planning is, do you have a good set of these inventory forms? Are they up to date? Is it a comprehensive look? And if not, then maybe you need to be doing more identification. So where are all your forms kept in Stowe? 2016, you did Yep, okay. So you had a consultant that was hired to go out and do more of these forms. Yep, okay. So there's forms for, this is what the back of a form looks like. It's got an architectural description and a historical narrative, all those things in terms of the architecture of the building and then the kinds of things in terms of who lived there, what kind of things did they do for work. It's going to be all the kinds of biographical kinds of information in terms of who had associations with that property. And there's all kinds of other forms out there. So there's area forms, there's building forms, there's object forms, archaeological sites, burial grounds, structures, streetscapes, parks and landscapes. There's all these different forms as a means to identify and document the kinds of things that you have in your community. But for the most part, the forms that are going to be in our files and in your local files are going to be these ones right here for buildings. Yeah, so that's whoever filled that form out thinks that it's eligible for the National Register. That's all that means. Whoever filled out the form. Yep. So it doesn't have a whole lot of meaning attached to it because it's basically the opinion of the person that filled out the form. So that historical narrative gets put together with all kinds of things like this: census records, maps, deeds, all kinds of wonderful materials like that to put together the narrative. Might use old maps like this from the atlases from the 1800s. These are one of the primary ways that we do a lot of the research. Is because it's nice and easy. You can use a map and find a lot of information just by looking at a series of maps. Sometimes we use things called reverse directories or city directories. They have wonderful information as well. You may not particularly have those in what was a rural community. Okay, and then there's the architectural description as well, which can be pretty complex to put together, and that's why a lot of these inventory forms are actually done by consultants that have a degree in architectural history. Was yours funded with Community Preservation Act funds? Okay. And did you get a grant from our office, or was that strictly 100% town funds? 100% town funds, yeah. Okay, great. So these are some of the things that we use the inventory forms in our office. And of course, they're used locally for things like school projects, master plans, open space plans as well. So they really are the building block for everything that the local historical commission is going to work on. So right now, you can go onto our website and get a sense of what's been done for inventory forms, although the ones that were done in 2016 probably have not been scanned onto our website yet. But you can actually get a good sense of what was done previously anyway, by clicking on something called Search Macros Database from our homepage, and it's going to bring you up to something that looks like that, and then you're going to put in the town name, and it's going to give you something like that, and then you can click right on the inventory form itself, and that form is going to come up as a PDF. All right, so what do you think? We have a neo-colonial here constructed in 1987. Should an inventory form be filled out for this building? No? You don't think so? Well, there was one filled out for that building from 1987. As you can imagine, the historical narrative was quite short. And it was filled out because these inventory forms get filled out by all kinds of different people, and a retired gentleman from that town loves filling out these forms. He loves it so much that he did everything from the 1700s, everything from the 1800s, working right through the 20th century, and he said, well, I guess I'll move on to the 1980s. And so he's completed, all the inventory forms for buildings that were built in the 1980s. And we gladly accept these into our office. Because filling out one of these forms does not mean it's significant. There's no statement of significance by filling out one of these forms. It's just a way to identify things, document things. And 100 years from now, maybe somebody will come in as a scholar and be like really delighted because he filled all these forms out. So this is certainly one that I look at and go, wow, that just reminds me of my childhood so much right there. Because that's what my neighborhood looked like. And yet this was taken just last year in a town in Massachusetts. And it's got so much integrity to it that I look at that and go, well, that actually really there's good reason to actually fill out an inventory form on something like this, because we've really got some good, there really is something impressive about this property. So there's no statement of significance at all for filling out these forms. We get them in for all kinds of different things, and happily take them into our office. Some towns have pursued a survey plan. Which other towns were here? Littleton. Littleton's been doing plenty of survey work. A survey plan might be a place because you're so far behind. I mean, I'm not saying that's true for Hudson, but for some towns they're so far behind that they really need to do a survey plan to find out where are the priorities for filling out these forms. So if I went to the town of East Brookfield, Massachusetts, they have about 5 of these forms. That's it. That doesn't give any indication that there's only 5 historic resources in East Brookfield. It's because nobody's gone to the effort of pursuing a project to get a lot of those inventory forms done in East Brookfield. So when they start, you got to start somewhere, and it's good to have a plan in place to say, these are the priority things that we need to survey ahead of time. You probably would not start with things from the 1980s, right? You'd probably start with some other kind of, some other criteria for where you would which ones would be done. Yeah, so let's actually talk about Gleasondale in terms of these forms right now. Stowe Historical Commission, what's the status of Gleasondale's inventory forms? What kind of information do you have right now? Done in 2016 or done 30 years ago? Okay, so most of the things were done in 2016. Okay, all right. So that might be, so if that wasn't true, and in terms of your question of where to start, if there was interest in a particular village because there were concerns about that village, because it feels like there might be some particular threats, demolitions, and things like that, well, your priority for that area might be higher, and maybe it's important to not only just think about new forms, but also to think about the ones from that area that were done 30 years ago that need to be updated. So it's all kind of thinking about ahead of time. What are your goals in having those forms filled out? Yeah. You got to start somewhere, and let's say you've only got a certain amount of money per year to hire a consultant to do that work. Well, then you got to think about what are the highest priority things that we need more information on. But sure, eventually, yeah, I mean, hypothetically, it would be great to have one of these forms filled out for everything in Hudson. But that's not going to be particularly realistic. So it's good to take that step backward and just say, okay, what are our priorities? So I grew up in Northborough. I met with Northborough a few years ago. Northborough was inactive. They did not have an active local historical commission for several decades. And their inventory form was done basically in the 1960s, not very complete, certainly not up to the standards that we would want to see on inventory forms nowadays. My advice to the local historical commission that was getting started was getting your survey updated is your highest priority, but I don't want you to do any of those forms right now. I wanted them to really spend the time to think about where were their priorities? Where did they think the first 100, 200 forms were needed in town, and then go from there. So if we hire a consultant, it's going to be these 100 properties this year, the next year another 100 properties, and build up that way. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's head on to step 2. We'll get right into some of the questions here. So step 2, when we talk about step 2 evaluation, what we're really talking about is the National Register of Historic Places. So like I said, when those forms, they don't have any basis into saying, filling out one of those forms is not a basis for significance. That's when we get to the second step, the 3-step process there. Evaluation of historic resources. So now we're going to take a look at those forms and get a sense of what's eligible for the National Register by looking at those forms. Because now we've got some good information. Now we've got good context. We've got good background on all these forms, on all the resources. So we can now have a much better sense of what especially appears significant. And for us, in terms of evaluating significance, that's going to be the National Register of Historic Places. Okay, so there's 3 things that we think about for the National Register, the criteria that might suggest it's significant. One could be some sort of an association with events, activities, or patterns, an association with important persons, distinctive physical characteristics, design, construction, or form, basically the architecture. And that fourth one, archaeology, the potential to yield important information. So there's no such thing, so the first part of that is there's no such thing as a state historic district. They don't exist. There is something called a State Register of Historic Places, and I'm going to get to that because it's, and I'll explain what that is because it's very counterintuitive in terms of what you would think. And we're also going to talk about a big distinction here between the 2 kinds of historic districts that are out there. National Register districts, which are part of the National Register, and local historic districts. So that's probably one of the main things that sounded like people had for questions earlier, and I definitely want to leave time to get to that. And I think by the end of tonight, you'll have a good sense of that distinction. And I think in terms of all those questions that you had earlier, I think we'll cover all of those. Okay, but let's talk a little bit more about National Register right now. So National Register of Historic Places, we have all kinds of things on the National Register. Very old properties, oldest properties in the state are on the National Register. The Fairbanks House from the 1630s right here in Dedham. But we have a lot more recent things on the National Register as well. Diners, gas stations, Gropius House in Lincoln. National Register has things like bridges, objects, structures. Now, here's one of the counterintuitive things about the National Register. Most properties listed on the National Register are significant primarily at the local level. So it's the nation's list, but it's on the nation's list because it's locally significant. So that's how you end up with all kinds of things in every town in Massachusetts that end up being on the National Register. It's not saying that it has a national significance. It is locally significant and has been put on the nation's list, the nation's register of historic places. So to be eligible for the National Register, properties have to have some sense of their historic character left. So if somebody came back in a time machine, would they still recognize where they are, basically? That kind of perspective. So here we have a mill building in Hopedale. Yes, it's vacant. Yes, it's got a little bit of some alterations there, but the massing, the sense of that the scale of that mill building, it's clearly still, anyone coming back would still know that is the mill in the town of Hopedale. So it still has its integrity to it. So what about these 2 properties right here? Would they be eligible for the National Register? So far, we've said these are not eligible. They are 2 churches, actually. And so they both had steeples. They've been highly altered in terms of losing the steeple, having commercial storefronts added onto them. They've gone through a lot of changes in terms of, and then covered with vinyl siding, lots and lots of alterations. Loss of integrity, not eligible for the National Register. All right, so advantages of being on the National Register, sense of community pride, owner appreciation, eligibility for some funding assistance if you're a municipality or a nonprofit organization. So that's a grant program through the Massachusetts Historical Commission, my office, Massachusetts Preservation Projects Fund. and that is only a grant program. That's a grant program that's only for municipalities like the town hall, the fire station, the library, things like that, or the nonprofit organization like a historical society, museum, or something like that. National Register listing has another advantage in terms of its some eligibility for tax credits, state and federal tax credits for income producing properties. All right, I know there's going to be more questions coming on National Register. Anybody have a question so far? No? Okay. So here's the basic process of listing on the National Register. There's an eligibility opinion. So you would ask the Massachusetts Historical Commission whether we think something's eligible for the National Register, a district, an individual property, something like that. We would then get back to you and say, yes, we think it's eligible for the National Register. That does not mean it's on the National Register by any means. That means somebody's still got to fill out a National Register nomination. So lots of times that's done by a professional consultant hired by the town in some cases, hired by somebody else, but usually it's going to be, just like those inventory forms are typically done by professionals nowadays, these National Register nominations are typically done by a professional consultant as well. Not always, so sometimes the local historical commission or a local historical commission member will fill out one of these nominations, but there's a pretty high skill set to be filling one of these out. I'm not trained as an architectural historian. I would really struggle with filling out one of these nomination forms. So after that nomination form is done, there's some public hearings involved here, public meetings to explain what the National Register is. Then it goes to the State Review Board, and then it goes to the National Park Service. And it's actually the National Park Service that puts it on the National Register of Historic Places. Okay, so here's this first really, really confusing thing right here, but it's not going to be the first confusing thing we talk about tonight. We'll have some other ones in terms of that difference between local historical districts and National Register districts. That definitely is a big confusing one. Okay, but let's start with this one. The State Register of Historic Places throws everybody off. In Massachusetts, the State Register is actually a compendium. So if you are what we call a local historic district, then you're automatically put on the State Register. If you're on the National Register, you're automatically put on the State Register. If there's what's called a preservation restriction, something that's right in the deed, that's automatically put on the State Register. There is no way to actually get listed just on the State Register. You can't do it. So we get this question all the time. I want to get listed on the State Register, and it's actually not possible. You got to be designated somewhere else, and then you're automatically put on the State Register. So it's very counterintuitive that way. And it's, if you went to New Hampshire, they do it completely different. But this is how we do it here. I think compendium would have been a better name, so I think calling it the State Compendium of Historic Places would have been a better name, because that would have set it off, made a nice distinction between National Register and State Register. But for whatever reason, they called it the State Register decades ago, and we've been stuck with that since. Now let's go on to step 3, protection. And let's look at this house right here. Is this building right here protected from demolition? We have the John Perkins House in Wenham, Massachusetts, circa 1710, listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1990. Is it protected from demolition? How many people say there's no protections? Or how many people would say this is protected from demolition because it's on the National Register? I got a yes. We got a. Any other yeses? All right. Nobody else wants to say. All right. The reality here is that this building was demolished in 2011, and it is not protected from demolition. National Register is basically an honorary designation, and unfortunately we lose buildings on the National Register all the time. So just by virtue of being on the National Register does not protect anything. And so that gets into this next part here, that there are two kinds of historic districts in Massachusetts. There are National Register districts, like in Sturbridge, and there are local historic districts, like they have in Arlington. They are not alike at all. So big difference between a National Register district and a local historic district. As we talked about already, National Register districts established by the National Park Service, primarily an honorary designation. Local historic districts established by town meeting or city council, they are very effective at protecting historic resources. So basically with a local historic district, if you want to demolish a building that's in a local historic district, you have to get that approved by a local historic district commission. So, who here lives in a town that has a local historic district? Hudson, yes. Hudson has a local historic district in the center of town. Are there any local historic districts in Stowe? No, right. Yes, there are no local historic districts in Stowe. Littleton have any local historic? No local historic districts there either. So I like to ask that question. So when I've done this presentation, I've actually shown this distinction here between the two kinds of historic districts up here. And then I've asked people in the audience, do you live in a town that has a local historic district? And a hand will go up, and I'll say, what town do you live in? And they'll say, Westboro. And I'll say, guess what? Westboro does not have a local historic district. They have a National Register district. I'm like, oh, okay. And then I'll say, okay, who else here lives in a town that has a local historic district? Somebody else will raise their hand. What town do you live in? Northbridge. And I'll say, guess what? Northbridge doesn't have a local historic district either. They have a National Register district. It's definitely a bit confusing. So that's why we have something called There's a Difference, a brochure that explains the difference between local historic districts and National Register districts. So it looks like that. You can get it right off our website. So just in 2 pages, it explains the difference between local historic district and National Register district. So, as this is confusing enough that I've actually been in meetings where where I've had people argue with me that they have a local historic district. So even though I'm trying to explain the difference between the two, they're so convinced that they have a local historic district that they've actually pulled the map of the district off the wall in their office and said, see, we have a local historic district here because it's local. It's in our town. I said, no, that's a National Register district. So we spend a little more time talking about that distinction between National Register district and local historic districts. They finally understand. And then a year later, they're calling me with the same kind of questions again. It's confusing enough that it doesn't stick. Like unless you're doing it every day, like I do, where I'm answering this kind of question constantly from our office, it's hard to keep that. It's hard to keep this thing straight. So that's why we have this brochure you can keep referring to. There's no set flow chart there, but certainly some places have done National Register district, and then a demolition occurs, something unfortunate happens, and lots of times people are like, oh, I thought we were all protected because we're a historic district. There's a sign when we enter the village. It says historic district. And then you explain, no, it's a National Register district. It's honorary, and that's it. And then they say, oh, okay, I guess we need to think about the next step there of more protection through a local historic district. There's hundreds of National Register districts, and there hasn't been any attempt to establish a local historic district after that. You can also be the other one. You could also be there are also places in Massachusetts that are only a local historic district and are not a National Register district. Walking tours. So we did a walking tour of Gleasondale earlier. Just having a walking tour raises the profile of historic resources. Gets a lot more interest that way. And to have that kind of collective sense that, yes, this is a special place, that's just an automatic way that things are just, there's a whole sense of a cultural aspect of that community of wanting to protect something that's very important. So you can do historic preservation certainly with regulatory and non-regulatory tools. So you could have walking tours, all kinds of other public outreach things, and you could have a local historic district. You could certainly do both, and actually that's the best strategy, to have real protection through a local bylaw and to do the public outreach. So that's the best one out there. The one that lots of people try to head to is this one right here. To only pursue that idea of doing the local historic district. To only pursue historic preservation through a regulatory approach. That one never works. Never works, always backfires. So, to me, yeah, public education, a great way to do protecting historic resources. Having that information on all those forms, and then getting that information out. So what some towns will do, historical commissions will do, or a friends organization, is when somebody buys a property in, say, the village, they then send out a letter, welcome to the neighborhood. We thought you'd like to know a little bit about the history of your house. And they attach an inventory form. So that's a great way to get a new owner involved and engaged, because when is a house most likely to be altered or demolished? New owner, maybe, yeah. New owner, somebody maybe coming in not quite appreciating the history of that property. So a good way to get that message across. Just having these maps available, so these wonderful atlases from the 19th century. I handed, when I lived in a neighborhood outside Boston, I was doing research in the neighborhood, and I handed out the series of maps to my neighbors, and my neighbors loved it. They loved seeing how their house was the second one on the street, the third one on the street, that the vacant lot had always been a vacant lot, and there was just all kinds of really interesting things that they kept coming up to me and saying, I didn't know that about this street. Public education, the whole idea of walking tours. So you have a wonderful little brochure that was put together by the society and the commission, I think. Is that right? Both of them put together, both as a joint project. So having that kind of a brochure available is great. Certainly some of the places of doing more smartphones and digital kinds of things in terms of walking tours. Doing all kinds of events through either a nonprofit organization or through the local historical commission, getting kids involved, using Historic Preservation Month in May to publicize wonderful things that could take place. Those are all great ways to do public education. If you are part of a National Register district, I think having signs is a wonderful thing. So when you drive through Massachusetts, a lot of places you'll see those entering historic district signs. Usually those are just National Register districts, so it's really just the honorary honorary districts. But again, having those signs really, it's all people have to do is drive by that, and whether you live there or not, it's a real recognition that I'm entering a special place. I'm entering a historic district. I'm entering something that's been put on the nation's list of significant historic resources. So I'm a big fan of just those nicely placed entering historic district signs. Another one, plaque programs, is some towns have a real active plaque program. So I've seen some plaques in Stowe, but is there an active plaque program in Stowe? It just started? Okay, all right. Okay. So the idea is that you have those survey forms where you had a data construction and a historic name that comes out through the survey forms. And then property owners can apply to either the society or the historical commission, who's ever running the plaque program, and say that I would like to have one of those plaques put in my house. And the historical commission will take a look and see, does their house qualify to have a plaque? So if the house is too altered, if it's covered with vinyl siding, sometimes maybe they'll say, no, it's not eligible, it's lost too much integrity. So there is a real sense of recognition by having one of these plaques, that your house being eligible to have one of those plaques placed on it. There's no requirement that a name, what a building has to be called. Sometimes it is the original owner, sometimes the builder, but yeah, lots of times it's somebody famous that lived there later, or somebody that really lived there for a long period of time. So the association is there with one particular person. So for me, the house that I live in, there was a woman that owned my house in the 1800s, and so she wasn't the original owner, but she was actually the person that owned the house longer than anybody else. And to me, that if I was going to have a plaque on my house, I would want it to be named after her, because she had the biggest association with that house. So there's public education, and then there's advocacy. So advocacy to me is a little bit different. That's where it's really, the historical commission typically is really taking a position about something in town. So it's public education is more proactive. Advocacy, you're reacting to something. You're taking a position. So talk about the canals of the city of Lowell and the advocacy here. So what name do we really associate in terms of the revitalization of Lowell? Paul Tsongas, yep. I was doing this in front of a young crowd recently. They didn't know who he was. They said Marty Meehan. Yeah, I felt really old. Yeah. Yeah, Paul Tsongas. So he was senator, Massachusetts senator, presidential candidate as well. But back when he was a city council member in Lowell, back before the revitalization, he really wanted to see Lowell improved somehow. And he was on the city council, and he thought the best way to save Lowell was to get more parking. And the best way to get more parking was to pave over the canals. Yeah, Paul Tsongas thought that. Yeah. It was other people in the city of Lowell that took him aside and said, Paul, there's another vision there. There's a better vision. Lowell's a special place, and the canals are what makes this a special place. And he recognized that. He took that. And Lowell had a very different future because he was able to recognize that. But as a local politician, and it took advocates in the community to talk to that local politician and suggest a different approach. So advocacy goes way back in Massachusetts. John Hancock Mansion, you can see these handbills placed all over the city. That building was lost, but you can see the idea of advocacy, trying to really save a property through taking an advocacy position. This is one in Southborough that you might be aware of from the local media. So this is a building that was threatened with demolition a couple of years ago. A bunch of high school students got out and started holding signs and really expressing their concern about this building being demolished. And they got into the local paper, they got into the Boston media, and then they got into some national media as well. And this building was just saved by Southborough Town Meeting with Community Preservation Act funds. So they had a very successful advocacy campaign there. So I like to say that you probably heard the saying right here, the future is determined by those who show up. I like to add this one right in there. The future is determined by those who show up at town hall. You've got to be active in your city or town hall. All right, so let's talk a little more about local historic districts. So this is the idea of how local historic districts work. They can guide appropriate changes and prevent inappropriate changes to structures. Local historic districts can permanently prevent the demolition of significant structures. But they are established through a 2/3 majority vote of town meeting. Once established, then they are administered, regulated by a local historic district commission. So Acton has local historic districts. Hudson has local historic districts. What other towns do you think around here have a local historic district? Concord has local historic districts, yep. Lexington, yep. Worcester, yep. Yeah. So all those places have local historic districts. So inappropriate alterations and demolitions can be prevented. This one obviously not in a local historic district. It demolished on the North Shore a couple of years ago. Now, local historic districts can actually be quite large, and they can be quite small. So the entire island of Nantucket, the entire town essentially, the entire town of Nantucket is a local historic district. Would anyone like to recommend that for Stowe? No? Do you want to bring that to town meeting? So you can be that large, but you can go down to the single building level as well. So you can have single building local historic districts. So Somerville has the most single building local historic districts. They have 200, over 200 single building local historic districts. But other towns have been doing single building local historic districts as well. That building right there is actually from Northborough. Single building local historic district established a couple years ago. It's usually demolitions and alterations. So it's only what is visible from the public way. So it is definitely limited in that way. It's only what's visible from the public way. But it's going to be what we call changes to exterior architectural features visible from the public way. So does that include demolition? Definitely, because demolition is a change to an exterior architectural feature, obviously. But it could be all kinds of other things as well. Now, like what, you might ask? Well, it's going to depend on how you write that local bylaw that gets passed at town meeting. So that is the local law, the bylaw that's passed by town meeting. So you could have all kinds of exemptions in there to say, this isn't going to be included, this isn't going to be included, this isn't going to be included. So you can certainly have exemptions there. But typically it's going to include a lot more than just a demolition. It's going to include demolition, additions, new construction, and other kinds of alterations as well. The 3 villages of Acton are all local historic districts, and they actually established those all at the same time. Hingham has probably like 5 or 6 local historic districts. Newton has 5 right now, I think. Concord has about 4. So you're certainly going to find plenty of local historic districts on the list that are not just in the center of town. Let's talk about a local historic district, or let's talk about a proposed local historic district of 100 properties. Let's say all 100 property owners are opposed to being in that local historic district. Nobody wants to be in that local historic district. Okay. It goes to town meeting. It passes easily at a 2/3 majority vote. It's a local historic district. Now, so that's how the local legislative process could potentially happen. Now we know, well, not that silly. We know that would never happen that way, because if there's that much opposition to a local historic district, it's never going to pass a town meeting, of course. So we got to make a distinction here between the power of town meeting as a local legislative body to be in charge of the decision making there, and basically the local democratic political process of do the people want this or not that are voting at town meeting. So another example could be, let's say, okay, let's go back to that single building local historic district. Let's say that property owner, that single building local historic district property owner does not want to have their house designated as a single building local historic district. Can they opt out? And they say, no, I don't want to be part of the local historic district. Do they have an opt out? It's up to town meeting. And so now we're actually talking where this has actually happened, where the property owner is 100% opposed to being a single building local historic district, but it's up to town meeting, local legislative body. It's up to that local legislative body to decide whether that's a local historic district or not. So passes town meeting at a 2/3 majority vote, it's a local historic district. So I was talking with somebody from Georgia yesterday, and the Attorney General in Georgia has talked about basically saying that the idea of having owner consent, it's against the Georgia Constitution, basically, because you can't, you're basically bypassing a legislative act. So we haven't talked about demolition delay yet, but let's say buildings under demolition delay, that usually means, I'm going to skip up to that. Okay, so demolition delay. So how does that work? Delay bylaws basically prevent historic resources from disappearing overnight. They give a window of opportunity to consider other alternatives. Delay periods are usually 6, 12, 18 months. Again, adopted by town meeting and administered by the local historical commission. So Stowe does not have demolition delay here. There's no demolition delay bylaw. But lots of towns do. So we have 130, 140 towns in Massachusetts that have demolition delay right now. Let's say a building is under demolition delay, and during the delay period, it goes to town meeting to establish a local historic district. So normally demolition delay is what, 6, 12 months, something like that, and after, as soon as, okay. All right, so protection, people often focus on these regulatory tools, the idea of local historic district, a demolition delay bylaw, other kinds of bylaws that are established by town meeting, the regulatory kinds of tools, the ones that where you can really prevent a demolition from happening, where you really have that ability to say, no, you cannot demolish that property because not that approval was not granted because it's part of a local historic district. But I take a very broad view of protection strategies. I think these are all protection strategies right here too. And they're often overlooked. The idea of public education, advocacy, planning, being active in local politics, establishing a friends group, creating a nonprofit organization. Yeah, the National Register. Yes, it's honorary, but it still has a lot of value to it because there's a great sense of pride. There's a whole recognition there locally that we have been put on the nation's list of historic resources. So even if it doesn't have a whole lot of protection there, National Register has great value. So I hear this all the time. We can't do historic preservation in our town. We don't have any regulations, no bylaws. And I say I don't agree with that at all. Because here's my counterintuitive reality there is that, yes, you actually can do historic preservation with only non-regulatory tools. You could just do wonderful things just with outreach in terms of just a public education program in terms of plaque programs, or as it ends, you can demolish it. It's all you get is that window of opportunity, right? As soon as that delay expires, you can demolish the building. But what if you establish a local historic district during the delay period, a single building local historic district during the delay period? What happens next? Can't demolish. That's it. Now you can be permanently prevented from demolition. So we have several cases of this in Massachusetts already where a local historic district is established during the delay period. All you get is that window of opportunity. So that's all demolition delay does. And yes, let's hope that somehow during that window of opportunity, 6, 12, 18 months, there'll be some other scenario that comes about. And there are lots of success stories. So actually, another one, Worcester's here. Do you recognize the blue house up there, top right? Okay, that's Worcester as well. In that case, the blue house there was next to a medical facility, like a professional medical office building, and they wanted more parking. And so the owner said, well, I'll buy this property next door, I'll demolish it, that way I can expand my parking lot. Went under demolition delay, and somebody really wanted to purchase that property and went to the owner during the delay period and said, can't we do both? This is a pretty big lot. Like, how about we change the property lines here so that I buy this house, but I have a smaller lot. You you purchase part of the lot, expand your parking, and then you get the parking, and I get the house that way. And so they worked out a new property line that way, and the building got saved. It's a wonderful story. So lots of success stories with demolition delay. The one up here, upper left, one of my favorites, the yellow house. It's in Eastham, Massachusetts. Came up under demolition delay. They got it into the newspaper, so there was an article about this building being demolished. And it's a fairly, it's a small, modest house, mid-19th century house. Particularly significant to Eastham, though, because it was a midwife's house. And lots of residents at Eastham were actually born here. So there was a real strong interest in saving this property. So once it was in the newspaper, somebody came forward and said, well, I have a vacant lot down the street. I can move it onto the vacant lot. And so the building was moved intact, so it wasn't taken apart or anything like that. And we don't really call those success stories. Here it was moved intact on a flatbed, moved about half mile down the road, and the owner rehabbed it. So yeah, it lost its context. It's no longer on that site anymore. But we still include that one in the success stories there. The lower left one here is in Reading, and very early property right there, early 1700s. And a developer was going to put in a subdivision, and because of some wetlands, that building was going to have to come down. So the Historical Commission then went to the Conservation Commission and said, Conservation Commission, is there anything we can work out here so that you can still get the same number of house lots here, but this house gets saved somehow? And yeah, it was worked out with the Conservation Commission to save this house. So real success stories there as well. So I met with a group that was interested in pursuing a local historic district recently. And I sat down with them and I asked my first question, who here lives in the proposed local historic district? Nobody from the group raised their hands. I said, okay, we got one problem here. I said, okay, who here has talked to property owners in the proposed local historic district? Nobody raised their hands. I said, we got two big problems here. I spent the rest of the time with them, an hour and a half, talking them out of pursuing a local historic district because they didn't have a constituency there. I mean, you've got to have an interest, again, going back to town meeting, you've got to have an interest there, people actually, a constituency that say, yes, we want a local historic district. I mean, to give you an example of the demolition delay, local historic district connection there, buy-in. Reading, the town of Reading, only has a 6-month demolition delay. There was a building proposed for demolition in Reading on a particular street, and the entire street, every property owner there was so upset that that building was going to be demolished that everybody wanted the local historic district. It was major buy-in to have a local historic district. They established a local historic district within 6 months. It was the fastest I've ever seen a local historic district get established. But usually doesn't work like that. So, yeah. So you got to have a really, you got to have some sort of a constituency, particularly for a local historic district. So for Gleasondale, yeah, what do you want to do? I mean, you want to get a sense of what do people think in Gleasondale. You want to be talking to a lot of people, holding either meetings, doing some sort of opinion survey, talking to people about what a local historic district means, what the benefits are for being in a local historic district, but also how that process works. What does it mean when you're going to make a change to the exterior building? What would that bylaw, how would the bylaw be written, and what would that process look like? So from all of that, there might be something that comes out and says, yes, Gleasondale, we are really concerned about what could happen to Gleasondale. We want to pursue a local historic district. If there was a constituency there to pursue that, it would go to the next levels. There's no benchmark that says a certain number of people have to want that. That has to be decided locally in terms of whether you have a big enough constituency to go some of those next steps of pursuing a local historic district. Maybe for Gleasondale, you would say, even though we're particularly vulnerable, we're very vulnerable as a village here in terms of demolitions that could happen to Gleasondale and we could really lose a lot. We still don't have a constituency that's really ready to say yes to a local historic district. So if that was the case, then maybe you'd pursue a National Register district. So you move forward with maybe doing the honorary version of a historic district, the National Register district. Okay, so buy-in for a National Register district. One of the things would be the public meeting, one of the initial public meetings to get a sense of are people interested in having a National Register district here. And usually, for the most part, when people realize that there's no regulations that are attached to being part of a National Register district, usually there's strong support for a National Register district, and it moves on from there. The only thing that can happen is that as the process moves forward, if more than 50% of the property owners submit a notarized letter to our office that they don't want to be part of the National Register district, then it's not listed. This has actually happened a couple of times. So I've been at Mass Historical Commission for about 20 years. I have actually seen this happen a couple of times. I don't really understand why, since it really is an honorary designation. But I have seen it happen a couple of times that enough property owners do not want to be part of a National Register district, and it's tabled. That's the end of it there. Local historic districts in a case like that would have the ability to prevent those demolitions from taking place, as well as design review over the new construction. So the new construction itself would also need approval by the local commission in that case. But again, before you really pursued that, it would be looking at what are all the other techniques that we could do to maybe look at protecting what's unique about that place before you head right to the regulatory aspect of a local historic district. Are there other ways that might be a little easier to pursue some protection strategies there? And does a local historic district have an impact on property values? So I can't give you a study from Massachusetts because we don't have one, but there are a bunch of studies that have been done around the country on that. For the most part, they find that if you compare local historic districts to similarly historic but not designated areas, property values go up a little higher in the local historic district. Now, one of these studies has actually been done in New York City. It was done by what's called the Independent Budget Office. So there was no There's no agenda there. They're basically just looking at the data. It's an independent office, and so that's one of the things that they found from that study as well. A number of the other studies that have been done by around the country. Some of those have been done by or funded by preservation advocacy organizations. So you can certainly say, okay, did they have a real agenda there in trying to demonstrate that kind of outcome, that the property values don't go down, they don't skyrocket, they stay a little bit higher than other areas. So the one that I like is the one from New York City the most, because it really is an independent study. So one of the main things that I hear when local historic district comes up is, I don't want to be in a local historic district because I want to paint my house any color I want. Interestingly, by far, most local historic districts in Massachusetts do not review paint color. No review. But some of them do. So you can review paint color, and you could find some places in Massachusetts where the only color you're allowed to paint your house is white. That's it. But that's not the case for most places in Massachusetts. There's no paint review color at all. So paint color is exempt. Yes, so right in the bylaw itself that goes to town meeting, there's a list of exemptions, and you can add things to that list of exemptions. I mean, typically, all local historic districts in Massachusetts have infill new construction that came much, much later. So you can go up to Salem, and amongst those wonderful, incredible federal period houses, well, there's a split level. You can find those things even in Salem. So there, in Salem, for instance, yes, that split level is still going to need approval before they make a change that's visible from the public way. Now, there's nothing there that can require a property owner to make that building look more federal. Absolutely not. I mean, everything is grandfathered in a local historic district. Once it's established, everything is grandfathered in. So that's how it typically works around the state. There are a couple of places that have taken that way further in terms of the new construction. So one town, that list of exemptions, included on their list of exemptions, it said buildings constructed after 1950 are exempt from review. So they really opened up a big exemption right there. So they say anything after 1950 is not going to have any review. So yeah, it was up to them. That's how they chose to do it. I didn't think it was a great idea, because you don't know what could get put in its place. So lots of those infill buildings, little ranches and things, those are often tear downs. Those are often going to be some of the first buildings to go. And if it's in a local historic district, you can have the ability to actually review what's going to be put up in its place. And what happens now, if it's exempt from review, you don't know you don't have any ability to say what's going up instead. For National Register, I mean, there is a delisting process for the National Register. I mean, in 20 years, I've never seen it actually pursued, because I don't really know why it would happen. Local historic districts, yes, you can go back to town meeting and basically de-establish, I'm not sure what the right word would be there, de-establish a local historic district through town meeting as well. And I have seen that happen. So Somerville, remember how I said Somerville had 200 single building local historic districts? What's that? Did you say something? Okay. So yeah, Somerville is 200 single building local historic districts. So a few years ago, one of those buildings burned to the ground. And so it was a vacant lot at that point. And basically they said, what's the point of having the single building local historic district here? The building is gone. And so they went through the process of de-designating that as a local historic district. Went back to, in that case, Somerville City Council. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming.